So welcome again, everyone, to our webinar. Again, it is titled California's New Electorate, the Strength of the Latino, Asian American, and Youth Vote. In the chat, you will see that I have a link to the report that we're going to be giving highlights from today, as well as a link to the full webinar series. So if you haven't joined us before for this particular series, you can learn about it at that link in the chat, as well as visit any of the videos as they are posted. We are partnering with the Price School of Public Policy at USC, and they are kindly packaging up the videos for us, and those will be available soon. And as well as our slides. So we'll send out a notice also on our listserv to let everybody know. So they have a second chance to view these webinars, but also to hopefully share the information, share the webinars themselves. So this webinar is part of the larger series, as I mentioned, on voter outreach and turnout. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump on in because we have a lot to cover. Of course, today is 45 minutes. All of our webinars in this series are 45 minutes, same time, same station, 12 noon Pacific time to 12:45, including our last webinar next week. All right, let me go ahead and share my slides. As I mentioned, part of the webinar series, a larger webinar series on turnout and outreach in California. Will voters turn out in November? Opportunities and challenges to conducting voter outreach in 2024. Today, we're looking at the strength of Latino, Black, Asian American vote in the U.S. as well as California. We'll be doing a comparison as we think it's important to understand California within the U.S. context and within the challenges, right, that the overall nation has when it comes to producing turnout, hopefully high turnout, but particularly when we're talking about disparities in turnout and also opportunities, right, for increased representation. So something I've talked about at the beginning of each of our webinars in this series is just to set the stage to talk a little bit about what I call an equitable election landscape. And when I talk about landscape, I'm talking about a lot of things here. Of course, disparities in turnout rates, which are quite significant. They have been historically, and they remain significant in the United States and California's elections. But all of the things that go along with that, so the pushes and pulls that produce that inequitable landscape. And because this is a series on voter outreach efforts, we're going to focus here. I'm focusing on highlighting the disparities in the outreach landscape. So we know that turnout is much lower for voters of color, young voters, voters from historically underrepresented groups in our electorate period continue to be low for those historically underrepresented groups. And at the same time, eligible voters, adult citizens largely, in the state also experience differing levels of outreach and information. All voters are to some degree information low, yes, even in the information age, trying to get information on not only who to vote for, but why to vote, why it's important, why it impacts their lives, and of course, even increasingly more difficult in our age now also of misinformation and disinformation. And we know that overall, in the broad strokes of things, brushstrokes, we know that voters of color, low-income voters, young voters are much more likely and much less likely to get outreach to get contacted by campaigns and candidates. And those, of course, are the ones that are overwhelmingly doing the outreach and mobilization and actually connecting with voters in our electoral system here in the United States. And because they largely use what we call likely voter models, they're commonly called likely voter models. Those models are going to predict out who are the likely or most likely to participate. So campaigns and candidates can use their dollars efficiently, strategically, get the biggest bang for their buck. And they look at past performance, if you will, right, or turnout levels, and a whole bunch of other data, and they predict those that are going to be the really high propensity voters that are currently and will be likely to vote in an upcoming election. And of course, they're not trying to get everyone to vote; they're trying to reach those that they think are going to be most likely to vote for them. And if it's not a competitive district, you'll see very little outreach to a whole swath of the potential electorate, even registered voter electorate. And we have, of course, lots of good really effective nonpartisan groups that try to make up the difference, but they're starting in an inequitable landscape to begin with not enough resources, right, to meet the scale of need. And same thing for election officials as well, although their overall purpose, right, is to administer an election, but they still need to get information to voters. And many, of course, want to go beyond and try to expand the electorate as well and reach those that aren't registered, but those are eligible. And they are also fighting an uphill battle in terms of the inequitable information landscape. So let's jump in here a little bit to the 2020 presidential election. So if we're going to talk about the strength of the electorate, let's look at the most recent presidential election. All eyes are on 2024, but what happened in the most recent presidential election? So I want you all to think, if this was a big room, I'd ask maybe some of you to shout it out and we'd have a conversation, but I'd like some of you just to think for a moment. Do you know what the eligible turnout rate was? And let me define that. That's the percentage or the share of those who are eligible to vote, adult citizens who actually cast a ballot in the 2020 general election, whether they're registered or not, just the eligible voter turnout. And if you know that number, do you know what the turnout was for voters of color, for Latinos, for Blacks, for Asian Americans, AAPI, or other groups? Well, we indeed had a record turnout at the national level in the United States. Many of you are very well versed in this field, of course, that have joined us today over Zoom. Others, even the general public probably heard at least a story or two through the news that we had record voter turnout. Maybe you might not remember exactly what that number was, but it was about 67, 68% almost of eligible voters in the United States that cast a ballot. That was a record as far as we can identify in terms of going back historically. So that also, though, didn't just give us a turnout rate that was a record at the U.S. level, but it generated the largest increase in number of voters between 2016 and 2020, right? 21 million more people voting than in the 2016 election. And of course, many Americans, right, thought that 2016 was a consequential election, but we saw turnout much higher in 2020. So a lot of positive stories, right, in other words, a lot of positive stories about the 2020 election. In California, we had a little higher turnout rate, 71% eligible voter turnout rate, the highest since the 1952 general election. So it wasn't a record, but it was the highest in decades. And we also saw more voters turning out, a state record for votes cast, 3.1 million more votes than during the 2016 election. So California did well as well, right, in comparison to the US as a whole. And the number of Latino, Asian American, and Black voters also grew notably between the two presidential elections. Voters of color were a substantial share, right? We want to make sure that that is understood, a substantial share of those casting a ballot in 2020. And across the United States, a major factor in the outcomes of elections, of actual races, right? Certainly in swing states, but at the state level, at the local level across the United States, voters of color were part of the decision factor, right? Decision-making process or the voting process and generating outcomes in communities. However, and we have to talk about, right, disparities. So it was a very good year in 2020 for turnout, but increases in turnout in that election didn't occur at the same rates across racial and ethnic groups, and in most cases didn't mitigate inequities in representation. And what I mean there, I mean two things. So there are the turnout rates, right? So we're talking about here first is the gaps across groups. So white voters having, for instance, higher eligible turnout rates than voters of color, or older voters senior voters having turnout rates much, much higher than youth voters age 18 to 24. And for our topic today, we're focused on race, of course. But when I talk about representation, that can mean a lot of different things to people. But here in the electoral context, for our purposes, we talk about representation as the share of the pie of voters that are actually casting a ballot, what the share is for Latinos, Asian Americans, and Black voters of that pie of voters compared to their share of the overall population. So for a group to be numerically represented at the ballot box, they would have, those two shares would be about the same. So Latinos were 30% of the population, the eligible voter population, I should say. They would be, to be represented, numerically represented equitably, they would be 30% of all actual voters in an election. Hopefully that makes sense. Those actually casting a ballot. But because of disparities in voter turnout rates, we see quite significant differences or gaps when it comes to representation at the ballot box by race and ethnicity. Of course, there's significant longstanding disparities that persist in turnout rates between race and ethnicity. I noted that at the beginning. And Latinos, Asian Americans, and Blacks continue to be underrepresented, again, in that comparison of share of actual voters to share of eligible voters. So there's a potential greater impact, though, for voters of color. Combined, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Black voters comprise 22.5% of voters casting a ballot, but nearly 30% of those eligible to vote. So that's that right representation gap. But at the same time, if you flip that and you think about, that means there's a lot of voters that are eligible, voters of color that are eligible to vote that haven't yet voted. They are an opportunity, right, quite significant in numbers, to enter into the electorate and be a powerful force and, of course, represent their communities very strongly, as they already do, but more. So with growing population numbers, voters of color are positioned to have a larger say in future elections under just current rates. But if there were higher rates of turnout with growing population numbers, in tandem with higher rates of turnout, if that were achieved, then obviously even more greater representation and more impact, right, for communities, a larger voice for communities. There's a potential impact also for voters of color in California. So combined, the same three groups, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Black voters, comprise 41.5% of voters casting a ballot in the 2020 general election, but nearly almost 54% of those eligible to vote. So again, that's that representation gap. But at the same time, right, if you flip it and think about it as an opportunity, there are a lot of eligible voters in California, eligible voters of color that are potential additions, right, to the electorate. With growing population numbers, voters of color are positioned to have larger say. Now, I'm going to talk about that when I talk about when I get into demographics in a little bit, and it's a complicated picture in California when we say growing population numbers. So I'll talk about what that is in a few slides. But first, looking forward to the upcoming election and even thinking beyond, it's critical to identify opportunities to both not just turn out voters, right, to be thinking about turnout or get out the vote, but to register as well in order to see a more equitable and robust U.S. and California democracy. Because as long as there are disparities in turnout, we have underrepresentation at the ballot box happening in the United States and in California. We do not have a representative electorate. So the pie of those actually, another way to think about this is the pie of those that are actually casting a ballot in any given election, whether it's high turnout, like in 2020, a record high year, or lower turnout, it doesn't matter, because the story is essentially the same. The pie of actual voters demographically looks very different than the overall population, but also of the overall eligible voter population, adult citizens. And that is kind of the fair way to compare the two numbers. So I'm going to give you numbers here because we're doing a national comparison. We're intentionally using a data set that where the methodology is consistent or essentially consistent across states. So we're presenting data from that we acquired from Catalyst, which is a very well-known data vendor. Citizen voting age estimates are from the ACS data from the census. That is at the U.S. level. At the California level, they're actually from the California Department of Finance, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. We also have data from the decennial census, and we have U.S. population projections, which are also sourced from the U.S. Census. And then, again, California numbers are from the California Department of Finance. So overview, I'm going to talk about turnout rates for the next few slides with 3 sections. turnout rates, demographic landscape, the changing landscape, and the opportunities for voter mobilization by state. Let's talk about eligible voter turnout. So, despite high turnout, remember that record year in 2020 that we just covered, large turnout gaps between people of color and white non-Latinos persisted. Here you can see this is a simple line graph. We start at 2016, right? We're comparing 2016 to 2020. You can see the increased turnout, right, from 2016 to 2020 for the total population for everyone. And there's that everyone line, which is yellow, in case you haven't identified it yet. There's that 66.7% I said earlier, that third of eligible voters that turned out. Much higher for white voters, again, using Catalyst data. Much lower for Latinos, Blacks, and Asian Americans here. And what I really am focusing on, right, is not just, again, the disparities, but the fact that the disparities persisted, right, even in a record high year. We knew that would be the case because we've not seen an election in the United States where we have equity at the ballot box or where we have the same turnout rates or no disparities. But it's still worth noting that they are there and they are significant. And then in 2022, part of the story in 2022, depending on what state you were in, is that turnout, again, in comparable elections. So when we talk about 2022, a midterm year, we compare it to 2018, which is a midterm year. And at least at a US level, states varied in terms of the story, but at a US level, with lower turnout in 2022 compared to the previous midterm, turnout gaps widened for all racial and ethnic groups. So we saw a widening of that disparity story from 2018 to 2022. Again, emphasizing the importance. We always hear so much about presidential years. Most research, right, by political scientists and political sociologists across the United States are focused at presidential elections. But research on midterms are incredibly important, and of course, primaries and other elections as well. Okay, I'm going to go through some of these fast because of time. Here are the next two slides. I just want to emphasize that there is a difference in the disparity story if you're looking at registered voter turnout versus eligible voter turnout. So registered voter turnout is the share of those, the proportion of those that actually, are registered to vote, who actually voted, registered voter turnout. And again, eligible voter turnout, your denominator is adult citizens, those who are eligible to vote. Always, or just about always, when we look at registered voter turnout, we still see disparities, but they are less pronounced. This is one of the reasons why our center always emphasizes, wherever possible when the data is available, if you're interested in understanding voice and representation, look at eligible voter turnout numbers and understand the disparities with that measure. One of the reasons that we see the differences, of course, is that registration rates in the United States are also quite significant by race of the city. Voters of color have lower registration rates than white voters or the general population. This is US and California. And those disparities in registration rates, right, have to be understood, right, when you look at registered voter turnout rates, because you can have, for instance, registered voter turnout rates in a community maybe where they're pretty equal, but disparities in registration rates mean, right, maybe you had not very many people registered, for instance. And so that registered voter turnout rate is really, in a sense, obscures or it's doesn't tell the story of actually how many people, right, and the proportion and the size of the voice of communities of color in a given jurisdiction. Similar trends occurred in 2022 midterm elections. It doesn't really matter across elections. We know that generally disparities are less pronounced if we look at registered voter turnout rates. So now I'm going to move over to California. And here, again, I'm using Catalyst data, our analysis of Catalyst data, because we're looking across the United States, we're looking across states and comparing California to the US as a whole. In our presentation here, we're comparing it to the US as a whole. So we need to use comparable data with a comparable methodology. So we see very similar story, right? Different numbers, but very similar story here in terms of disparities across race ethnicity in the 2020 general election. So our analysis shows that overall eligible voter turnout rate a little bit lower than the official number that I gave you, I think, in one of our first few slides. So it's 67%. But again, comparing apples to apples, if you will, in terms of the methodological approach, 78% for white, Latino 55, Black 56, and Asian American 52. Now, if you've been on other presentations that I've given, you know that I talk quite often about the reliability of identifying race, ethnicity out of the voter file. So these are obviously estimates from the voter file. Anytime you do imputation, whether it's from CID, whether it's Catalyst, whether it's another data source, there are cautions that need to be understood, particularly for Black voters. Largely because we do not have race ethnicity to a significant degree identified for voters in the California voter file, and that's the case for most states across the United States. Researchers have to do what's called imputation. So you're statistically guessing somebody's race or ethnicity in the voter file based on there's two main things: their surname, as well as the population makeup of their jurisdiction. That's using census data. It can be in a state like California, pretty reliable for Asian Americans and Latinos, can be less reliable for Black voters because the population, the way the population is distributed, and because it's much smaller proportionally, not numbers, but proportionally. So, we show these numbers for Black voters because Catalyst, because of the consistent data source across the United States, but we just caveat and urge some caution because imputation is not perfect. There is no way, right, when you're statistically guessing to have obviously to have a 100-degree of certainty. All right. And then for midterm election, obviously much lower for everybody here, as it is for the United States, and it was across the US in 2022. But again, a similar story in terms of disparities. So eligible voter turnout by state. So here, what we're looking at, again, is consistent analysis and data source, and we've broken up into 5 categories, and the next several slides all use the same scale across groups so that it's comparable and hopefully easier for the reader or the viewer. And what we can see here, if we just look at eligible voter turnout rate, this is for Latinos, and we'll show it for other groups in a moment. So the share of the eligible Latino population that turned out to vote in each state. And you can see the kind of higher to lower, right, depending on the color here. And California finds itself not in the highest turnout, but in the group that's second highest, just as we've presented it here. Again, I'm doing this kind of simply for our webinar. Here, again, we're looking at eligible voter turnout now, but now we're looking at the disparity. White turnout, which is higher, of course, the difference between white turnout and Latino turnout. So that disparity story, right? And you can see now there are a couple exceptions here with Montana and Maine, where the data is just skewed because of the size of the Latino population. So if we don't look at that, again, we can see, though, across the United States, we see differences, right? And for our purposes today, that's what I want to emphasize, is the differences in that disparity story by state. And again, we get into details in the report as well, and in our appendices that are attached to the report. You can look up every state and the disparities for every state and have that available to you. So for today's purposes, I will just present what you see here, and then invite you, of course, to look at those details. Asian American, again, this is the eligible voter turnout of the Asian American population by state across the United States. You can see some much higher numbers right in the Southeast, for instance. California is kind of in that middle range, if you will, again. Eligible voter turnout disparity, this is the difference between white, non-Latino, and Asian American. So much smaller numbers, but with our outliers up there in Maine, you can see those still differences across the state in that disparity story. So if we flip it, that's also differences across the state in the opportunity story. But right now we're focused on disparity. Eligible voter turnout for Black voters across the United States. Understanding here that the reliability of imputation for Black voters does vary by state, as I said, more challenging in California. States like Georgia, for instance, have nearly everybody on the voter rolls that are identified as Black, so they do not have to rely much less on imputation. But we see differences again across the United States. And then the disparity story as well. All right, for time, I'm going to move on. Let's talk about demographic change. So part of the strength story or the opportunity story is looking at demographic change. So if we look at just 2010 to 2020 population of Asian American, Black, Latino, white, across that decade and as the US as a whole, you can see there was significant change, right? The racial and ethnic makeup of the country continues to diversify. Asian Americans over that time period, we know that there are certainly concerns and challenges with the US Census data, of course. But here we present the data that we have. So Asian American increased just over 35%. This is the actual numbers. Black, 6%, Latino, 23%, white, non-Latino actually declined in the United States, and overall US population, 7%. People of color are comprising an increasing share of the population for diversifying the nation. So here we're looking at shares. I showed you the change, right, from one number in 2010 to one number in 2020. Here I'm showing you specifically the pie of the population in each year and how that changed. So for Asian Americans, by the time we get to 2020, 6.1% of the US population, again, their share of the overall population, and that changed 1.3 percentage points. You can see 4.8 to 6.1. Black declined by 0.1, now at 12.1. Latino 18.7, up by 2.4 percentage points, and white declined by 5.9 percentage points. Now currently, according to the U.S. Census estimates, at 57.8%. And again, that's a proportional story. I want to go back for just a moment again and show you there has been positive change for people of color, right? The exception being white here, as you can see. But every group, Asian American, Black, and Latino, all had population growth, period, in sheer numbers. Make sure that's clear. But at the share, the proportional kind of pie story, that was different, right? So the largest growth was Latino and Asian Americans, or really the growth that we saw was from Latinos and Asian Americans, and that's because of the sheer size of their numbers, right, overall, and the growth that meant that they dominated the proportional change story. Now, the U.S. Census, and these are just their new set of projections that are just a few months old. So the U.S. Census projects that by 2045, white non-Latinos, their share of the population will drop to 50%, while people of color will represent larger shares. So again, on the left, far left, 2025, those are the numbers very similar to what I just gave you. And then you can see the projected change over time. Of course, projections are only as good as the formulas that they're based on, right? There's assumptions in terms of fertility rates and death rates. Immigration policy changes, right, could impact this as well. And the U.S. Census has caveated their projections as they've released them. I welcome you to take a look at those. But here you can see the change, right, in the United States, becoming more people of color, higher proportion of color, and a smaller proportion white. Now let's talk about the eligible voter population, which is adult citizens. Now, when we talk about voting, we have to understand, right, that there can be differences. We have to be looking at the eligible voter population and understand the change in time specific to that population and the proportional story by race and ethnicity within that population. So here from 2010 to 2020, again, for time, I'm just going to have you focus on the far right side where I highlighted. You can see that in every group, including white non-Latino, that there was a growth in from 2010 to 2020 in numbers, right? For the US as a whole, 11% growth in the eligible voter population, almost 39 for Asian American, 14.5 for Black. So yes, there's an increase, right, for Black eligible voters in the United States, Latino 51%. So we hear this story, a very little change, or at least less change, and we know from the eligible voter population, it is growing substantially. And then eligible voters of color also increased their share of the overall eligible voter population, while the share of for white non-Latinos dropped. So here again, we're just going to look at 2020 for time. You can see that the share of the overall eligible voter population for Asian Americans, 4.5, 12.5 for Black, 12.8 for Latino, 67.6 for whites. Again, this is share, so the change over time, that very far right column, the percentage point change. A little less here, right, when we're looking at this, but 0.9, this is a proportional story, again, not sheer numbers, but 0.9, 0.4, 3.4 for Latino, and white in the proportional change story, their share again dropped. Let's now talk about California demographic change. So I think most of our viewers are from California, and we said this was going to be about California. I want to emphasize a couple of things here. So the data source that we're using here is from the California Department of Finance. And we're showing you two sets of numbers as we did for the US, total population growth and eligible voter population growth. And what we've done is, if you know our work for the last decade or so, the CID has made available estimates and projections for the California eligible voter population, adult citizens. And those are because of our partnership with the California Department of Finance. As they periodically, every year and periodically, put out population estimates and population projections. We worked with them to specifically create data for the eligible voter population. Because if you use ACS data with its many challenges, but if you use American Community Survey data, product of the census, which is what you have to use if you want to look at adult citizens, and you want to look at a below state level, if you want to look by counties, for instance, there are a lot of challenges in using those data because they are ultimately survey data, and the error in those data can be quite significant at smaller populations. So having something that's homegrown from California provides us the ability to be able to look at a county level. So that being said, happy to answer more in the Q&A. But so we've got kind of apples to apples here in California, looking at estimates from the same source, hopefully that's clear. So what we see, but now what I'm doing is I'm actually going to focus for time going forward, specifically on these charts, 2024 to 2040. And in our report, we don't show you these data yet because they were not yet available. So this is really just for our discussion, right? Advancing what we have in the report. Hopefully that's also clear. So from 2024 to 2040, where are we going? I just showed you this chart, the US projected total population. Now I'm going to show you, right, the projected total population for California. So Asian American, there is expected growth, right? 3.5% change, Black 2.8, Latino 2.4, white non-Latino 3.4, and other 3.7%. So it's going to grow. And there's a lot of conversation, right, about, the California population is not growing anymore. Now, granted, it depends on how you want to define growth. From that large of a time period, yes, it's fairly anemic growth. But there is growth, and growth for every group. So I want to make sure that's clear. But the racial and ethnic makeup of California's projected population will not diversify. And again, this is projected into the future, right? But if we look at that proportional change story, as we looked at for the US a moment ago in that line graph, we see something very different. So the proportional change story doesn't really change. So look here at the far right, and you can see that Asian American is just 0.1%, Black essentially flat, Latino essentially flat, right? Or same as Asian American, white non-Latino essentially flat, and others. And yes, those are correct. And And this is the story. So if you've looked at any of our work over the years, again, we've shared population projections a number of times and updated them over the years. And every time that we've updated them, again, working with the wonderful folks over at the California Department of Finance, it doesn't look like this, right? So the white population proportionally declines more. The Latino population increases. Yes, it's fairly flat for Asian Americans and Blacks. Again, population growth, but we're talking about the proportional change story. But estimates have been revised, and the total population projections that the Department of Finance has put out for the general public, which look just like these, have been adjusted. And that is a product of a number of reasons, but largely because of change in the expectations around fertility rates, the younger median age for Latinos and Asian Americans impacting that. And these estimates, again, or these projections, could change in the future. Again, there's going to be some growth, right? But the proportional change story looks very similar, very essentially flat. However, when we look at eligible voter population, it's a different story. And that, again, we emphasize it's important to be looking at these sorts of numbers. So you can see for each group here, let's just look on the far right because of time. Asian Americans, 11.1%. This is the eligible voter population growth, the change from 2024 projected to 2040 projected to the change in actual number. So 11% higher projected for Asian American, 5% for Black, 17% for Latino, 2% for white, and 13% for other, all voters 9%. And here's that proportional change story. I'll show you that graph like the US one in a moment. Here you've got 4.7, share of the population by the time we get to 2040, 14.7 for Asian Americans, 6 for Black, 36 for Latino, 40 for white. And here's that chart. In years past, when we've shown this, Latinos and whites, by 2040, the two bars connect, and they're both at about 38% of the eligible voter population projected in 2040. So as you can see here, that white bar is green. The estimates or the projections have changed now to mean that Latinos will still be a smaller proportion by almost 4 percentage points of the eligible voter population by that year compared to whites. But we still do see change and growth over time for those two groups. Again, we will see change for Blacks and Asian Americans as well. I showed you those numbers, but again, this is the proportional story. Opportunities for mobilization. So historic representation, right, gaps have persisted. We've shown you that, we've talked about that, with people of color representing smaller shares of votes cast in elections than the share of the eligible voter population. Gaps widened nationally between Latinos and Blacks, while Asian American representation gaps slightly narrowed, again, nationally. Nationally, in recent midterm years, the representation gaps widened for all racial and ethnic groups examined between 2018 and 2022. In California, it's a little bit more of a complicated story at the 2020 presidential level. We essentially didn't see a change in the disparities as data has allowed us to examine across groups. Now, that being said, with our new data from the California Department of Finance, we are very shortly going to be presenting a new relook, if you will, maybe that's a better way to say it, a relook at the California story in terms of turnout in the last couple of elections. The story overall still doesn't change, but there are some interesting adjustments based on new data that we've received. And I'm not talking, of course, about the projection data, but also data that has allowed for adjustments to 2020 numbers. And again, with the eligible voter population. Heading into the next election, there are considerable opportunities to mobilize eligible voters of color, maximize their influence in election outcomes. Right, this is the opportunity across all states. Larger share of eligible voters of color didn't cast a ballot, totaling 34 million potential voters, representing nearly 15% of all eligible voters in the country. Voter mobilization is only one piece, of course, when we're talking about improving turnout and representation in both California elections and US elections. We need to always keep front of mind current and historic policies that have really been designed to discourage voting that disproportionately impact communities of color. They need to be addressed in tandem, right, with increased mobilization efforts. And that's why so much of the work that we've done with this series has focused on the last 3 webinars, right, and the reports that we've released have focused on understanding more about the California voter experience, what we can learn to help inform more aggressive, more accurate, more impactful voter mobilization efforts, again, considering that inequitable landscape that I talked about at the beginning, in order to potentially, right, move these numbers, to improve these numbers, and also considering the large opportunity with so many voters of color in California and nationally that are not voting but are eligible to vote. And I've talked about this a little bit, just really quickly. I'm going to, because of time, just show you share of eligible voters who didn't vote. Again, that varies. So again, of the eligible voter population, subtracting those who voted, just really quickly, you can see that changes across time. Same scale, just so for comparison purposes, right, for Black voters as well. And Latino, Asian American, and Black voters comprise 22% of voters casting a ballot in that 2020 general election, but nearly 30% of those eligible to vote. Just to put a finishing point here, in California, it's 41% of those casting a ballot in the 2020 election, but nearly 54%, as I mentioned earlier. And then at a national level, we look at absolute numbers. We're talking 15 million Latinos, 5 million Asian Americans, plus, and 13 million Black voters. And voters represent diverse communities with a wide range of experiences, ideas, needs, opinions, and all of that, of course, should be equitably represented. We hope everybody agrees, right, in a strong democracy throughout the political process. We're not talking here about partisanism. We're not talking about who wins elections. We're talking about representation and voice. Considerable opportunities to mobilize eligible voters of color are present, and to maximize their influence, right, for whatever their interests are at the local, to achieve whatever their interests are at the local and national level. And that brings us to one last slide. Greater and more sustained nonpartisan investments. Yes, of course, I have to talk about this before I can let any of you go. I started at the beginning talking about the scale of need when it comes to outreach and mobilization. We've talked a lot about numbers to show you that. We've talked about the opportunities, but yet those that would do that nonpartisan mobilization are underfunded. Election officials are underfunded in the United States by and large, and certainly community groups, nonpartisan groups, right, community groups, voter advocacy groups are under-resourced as well, and there needs to be sustained off the election cycle. As we know from research, that groups need not to just hear, right, 2 weeks before the election or even 2 months before the election, the case for voting needs to be made to counter all of those barriers that are present in our electoral system, that the investment needs to be off the election cycle. It needs to be continuing. And in tandem with addressing those historic and current policies that I mentioned that are barriers to voting, voters of color will need to, mobilizing voters of color to vote will not only increase their political power, but also create a more representative democracy, and ultimately, as democracy is supposed to be about outcomes, achieve better outcomes, better life chances among all Americans. Questions? I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Again, I welcome you to view our new electorate report that is available on our website. For those of you that joined potentially a little late, I'm going to put the information again in the chat, the links. One moment. There we go. If you join after something's in the chat, you're not going to see it. And all of the information, there's data for California in the appendices. Again, caveats significantly so for Black voter data, for the limitations. As researchers, we always emphasize that because of our requirement to do no harm. But at the same time, because this is a national study and we're using consistent data source, and for many, many states, voter numbers for Black voters are robust and highly reliable. We want to make sure that we provide an inclusive conversation, but we just ask that you consider the caveats. And also note that that last section that I covered here today, which was a overview of California's demographic change, projected change, those numbers are not in this report. They will be available soon through our website, through an additional report, but you can also get them on the slide deck that will be made available along with this recording. So all slide decks will be available. You don't have to sift through a recording. Let me see if I have, nope, I had a couple anonymous comment or two. Thank you very much in the chat. I don't think I have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and close us out. Again, soon the recordings will be available for this and our other webinars. I thank everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you for digesting all of that information very quickly. And hopefully we'll see you next week at our last webinar in this series. And again, go to our website to see all of the reports that we've been releasing recently. Thanks again.